Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mark Anthony's Music Picks. Today is episode 106, and for today's episode, my featured artist is going to be Robert Hood, a much and well-regarded techno expert, aficionado. He's one of the originators of Detroit techno, and he is basically one of the first to start dabbling in the minimal aesthetic. Robert started making his specific and very refined brand of minimal techno as early as 1991. I believe his first release ever that was put to vinyl was on Underground Resistance. Now, I have to admit before I get into this episode that mid 90s and early 90s minimal techno for the most part is out of my wheelhouse. It's not my jam. It's like a very hard pounding vibe, and I wasn't around for it. I wasn't going to clubs in the early 90s, so I don't have anything to really associate that with. I tend to like beats that are a little bit slower, and if you notice in this episode, a lot of the samples that I'm going to present to you are pitched down, and that's because it makes the type of sound that Robert Hood makes a little bit more palatable for me and brings it closer to something that I would actually play out or play in a set. Before this episode, I watched a couple of interviews with Robert Hood, and I have to say I'm really impressed with the guy. He seems like somebody that you would really want to run into, like out in public if you could, and talk to him, maybe sit down and have a beer, ideally, because he's one of those guys that just, you can tell he really likes the music, and you get the vibe that he's into it for the right reasons. And anybody that's been in the scene for as long as Robert Hood has, and like has stayed true to a sound, I really respect that. And that's one of the things that I notice about a lot of Detroit artists. Like pick your Detroit guy, Moody Man, Delano Smith, Norm Talley. They basically have a sound, they refine it, and they more or less stick with it. Now, it's not to say that they don't evolve, but they don't chase a fad, they don't chase a trend. And that's what I like about him. So he's just been hanging around making different types of techno and house and disco and putting them out on, for the most part, his label M.A.M.P. Now, Robert Hood releases on a ton of labels. You never know where his remixes are going to show up, which, I'll get to later in this episode. But for me, the M.A.M.P. label is kind of where I focus my attention on. I subscribe to those alerts on Juno where you can listen to, or not listen to, but basically get an email every time a new release comes out for a label, and M.A.M.P. is one of the alerts that I have set up because I always like to check them out. That being said, even within the M.A.M.P. catalog, there's a lot of music that's a little bit too loopy for me, and that's fine. That's for other people. But like I said, there's some disco and house influence in there, and those are the ones that I tended to gravitate towards there. So today, oh my gosh, I don't know. I have a pretty decent pile of Robert Hood records here to go over with you, maybe 6 or 7. So I hope you guys enjoy these picks, and let's get started. My first is an old minimal record from Robert Hood, and this came out in 1994, I believe, initially on the Internal Empire release. Now, if you go and look at the reviews for Internal Empire, there's a lot of dudes that are probably like 48, 49 years old, a little bit of gray in their beard that regard this as some kind of, like the holy commandments that were brought down from the mountain. Like people, there are people that just absolutely obsess and like scrutinize and like pontificate about Robert Hood's early releases. I kind of like missed the boat on it. I don't feel like I needed to own Internal Empire when I sample it, but the one track that really stood out to me was Meanies. And Meanies came to me by way of a compilation that Heinrich Schwartz released in, I don't even know when this thing came out. It looks like 2009 this came out. But this is a really interesting release here. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here, but I'll show you guys the track list if you want to take a quick look at it. I feel like everything on here is good. There's like a Richie Houghton on here and a Mika Viano. If you know, I never know if I'm saying these guys' artist name right, but Robert Hood Minus is featured on here, and I initially played it at the wrong tempo. I played it at the 33 RPM. And I actually like it at 33. I feel like it's better. It's actually something that I would mix into a set if I was trying to play like some weird minimal. This reminds me of Richie Houghton's project, the concept project that just got a triple pack reissue. If you guys like the vibe of this Minus sample that I'm going to give you, also check out the concept triple pack reissue. Really good plates there and really good sound quality. But getting back to the track Minus, when I listen to it, it's kind of a mind F, right? It's one of those tracks that there's something about the tonality in it and the very gradual change that just sort of does something to your brain and kind of scrambles it, even in a dead sober state. It does something weird to your ear, and it's hard for you to dial it in. And I was sitting there listening to it, and I was trying to assess its weirdness, and I came up with, I think the time signature is a little bit off there. I think it's a 3/4 time signature, where like almost like a waltz. A waltz techno beat. I think that's what's happening there, and I think that's what gives it its strangeness. Now, if you look at the waveform for the track, even though it sounds static, if you just kind of pick up the needle and move it through the record, it sounds relatively static at first listen, but it's not. There's actually peaks and troughs in the waveform, and I think that kind of gives it that journey feeling. While I'm talking about this, there is a modern project by, I think it might be a duo or a trio, called Dawn of Midi. It came out in 2013, and it has the same type of time signature experimentation in it. The album is called Dysnomia, and it came out on CD and wax. And I looked on Juno earlier this week, and there's still a few copies left. So maybe check that out. So if you like Minus and you want that sort of odd minimal vibe, also check out the Dawn of Midi. Earlier I mentioned that Robert Hood features and shows up in remix form on all kinds of labels and places that you wouldn't expect. So that brings me to my second release here, which is this one. This is the Deep Blue Meanies remix from, gosh, maybe 2010. Now, when Juju and Jordash first started releasing, I had the first release on their label, and I was really captivated by their sound, because back in 2009, there wasn't really anybody that sounded like them, and I thought it was really interesting, and it was kind of the kickoff for Dekmantel. Now, Dekmantel has become huge. It has its own festival, and it has a ton of followers. Like, it's an extremely popular label. But as it's gone through the years, it's actually lost me more and more. I think the last Dekmantel, or the most recent Dekmantel that I purchased, was the DJ Python. And DJ Python, he's got his own vibe going on, and I'm definitely glad to have that one in my collection. But Dekmantel went from like almost like clubby, housey vibes to more of like a soft, nondescript aesthetic that I'm not even really sure like what kind of vibe they're trying to create anymore. That's why I said I'm lost there. But back like I said, this came out in 2010. This was a heater. There's two Robert Hood remixes on here. There's the sci-fi mix, and I think the other one. What's the other one? I think it's like the Mono Box remix. They're both cool, but almost like opposite or opposing vibes. The The Monobox remix is a little bit more subtle and low key with a little bit of a more bass ridden, whereas the A side, the one that I like the most, the sci-fi mix, has that like classic Robert Hood punch to it. And in a lot of Robert Hood's tracks, it comes down to one element for me, and there's just like a blitterdoop, blitterdoop. It's kind of ridiculous, I know, when I try to like imitate these sounds, but just like the boobadoop and the reverb on that, that's something that I would really like to hear out at a venue, and that's something that would kind of like invigorate me on the dance floor. I don't do this often, but on the next record that I'm going to show you, I actually want to give you a clip for both sides of it because I think they're both really interesting for different reasons. This is Robert Hood's release on Music Man Records, and this is a very cheap kind of sleeper record. I looked on Discogs and it's for sale $5, $6, $7, and nobody had written any reviews for it, I don't think, but I do think it's a standout in the catalog. There's 2 tracks on here. One I would consider tech house, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other one is movement here, which is almost like ambient. It was hard for me to decide what genre to even describe this as when I was talking to you. But the vibe that it creates for me, the feeling that I get from this is it takes me back to when Xbox first came out. When Xbox and Halo first came out, that was like kind of a special moment in video game history for me. I remember I would play it. I lived with my parents post college, and I would just like hang out down in the basement with the lights off at night. And when I played Halo, there were some scenes in the first 2 or 3 levels where you would end up in a spaceship, and you'd run around and you'd kill a couple of those little guys, the little grunt guys. But for the most part, there was a lot of downtime as you were sort of walking through the spaceship, and there was music that would sort of cascade in the background and give you this ominous feeling like you were on enemy territory. And I think that's what movement creates there. If you listen to most electro records, they have a sci-fi feel and they feel dark, right? There's no like happy electro, if you ever notice that. So this is almost like the background sounds of a classic electro track, like somebody like ERP would make, but with a really subtle, minimal Robert Hood kick. And I think that this stands out in his catalog because it's almost ambient. I would say that it fits into ambient more than any other category, but with an electro overlay, and I really appreciate it for that. Now, on the B side of this record is a track called Torque 1. And when I was listening to Torque 1 before I made this episode, I almost came to the conclusion that it's tech house. And you don't hear too many people, I don't know if I've ever heard Detroit tech house before, but if there is Detroit tech house, I would say that Torque 1 fits the category for it. It has all of like Robert Hood's signature classic like 90s house sounds at a 120 BPM, tempo. And when the techno vibe that kind of underlies the track fuses with that house, I guess that's why it would be called tech house. It just comes together in a very unique fashion, and I wanted to just show you Torque 1 because Torque 1 to me is the only track that I've ever heard in Robert Hood's catalog that would fit the vibe of a tech house set. And like I said, I don't go for banging techno too much, but here, why not, right? First of all, I gotta say, I absolutely love this cover art. This is like, let me take this out. Look how sharp this is. It's almost like a reddish pink. I guess the color would be fuchsia, and you got this cool little like diagonal grid here. I absolutely just adore this cover art here. And my favorite track on here was the Phobia Replant. And in Robert Hood techno tracks, again, there's always that one like mid-range upper frequency element that kind of sets it off for the tracks that really like get to me. And this one has that buzzer sound that's just kind of going off every beat or two, and I can really picture this going off peak time. So if you're into the banging techno, I think this is probably going to be the most banging pick out of the episode. And coming into more modern times with Robert Hood, I think this is a 2021 release. This might have came out at the very beginning, about a year ago of 2021. This is again on M.A.M.P, and a track that has a ton of reviews for it on Discogs, or an EP that has a ton of reviews for it on Discogs. This is the Struggle / Save the Children EP. And I love it when I read comments and everybody's disagreeing about which track is the best on the EP. That's how you know you got something good there. The Struggle on the A side is a long track that basically has a monologue from a black woman that's talking about oppression and like basically having to overcome some of the social obstacles that are in place in modern times. And I like that one. It's got a really banging vibe, and like the anger in her voice is really cool to listen to. I just really enjoyed that. On the B side, my pick for this episode is Save the Children. The strategy of Robert Hood to grab that sample, to recognize the power in that girl's voice for Save the Children and loop that, it's like, yeah, nod to you there, Robert. That was a good pick. Now, there's a Detroit mix that's like a really banging classic techno heavy track, like a very heavy Detroit vibe that a lot of people are gravitating towards. I'm not saying that that's a bad track. That's just out of my wheelhouse. The original Save the Children non-Detroit mix, to me, is a triumphant house track, and I think it shows off some of Robert Hood's diversity. I like the fact that he's not just a techno guy, and this is actually, Save the Children to me is a bright sunny day house track with a nice, powerful kick. And last but not least, I wanted to save the best for last. My pick for the best track of this episode is We Magnify His Name. And the reason that I took this out of its original M.P sleeve is because I wanted to actually take a little side tangent before I talk about the track to tell you about this. So I read a book years ago. I would read it repeatedly over and over again, and it was called How to DJ Right by Frank Brewster, or Bill Brewster and Frank somebody. And it's a shame I can't remember the author's names at this point. I read that book so many times that it literally fell apart. Like, it was my Bible, because it had all of the ground roots ways to DJ. It taught you like harmonic mixing. It taught you mixing strategies. It taught you things about how to put a piece of cue tape on a record that you find to be difficult to cue. Now, this record is difficult to cue for me. You can't really, for me, in my opinion, you can't really just start this at the beginning of the record and trust that it's going to come in on time because of the way that the intro is structured. So if you want to ever take a record and make it easier to play, like if you're playing vinyl out, I don't know if recreational DJs even play vinyl out anymore, because modern club party environments are very like transitory, and very often the setup is being like built and set up and taken down on the spot, which makes the setups precarious and not very vinyl friendly or reliable. That being said, maybe you want to make it easier to cue so you can play it at home. And what you can do is get this tape. You have to go to the craft store, where, you know, you walk into the craft store and there's, you know, women at the register, and they kind of look at you like, what's this guy doing here? You know, it's one of those fabric stores where you walk in there and like Joann's Fabrics or something like that. And you can get this. It's called Low Tack Artist Tape by Scotch. Maybe Amazon has this. And it's tape that is kind of thick, and all you need is a razor blade to cut a little rectangle of it about the size of this. And what you do is you wind the record to where you want the needle to drop every time you play it. And you angle the tape such that it guides the needle into the groove. So as you wind the record onto this tape, you'll hear the needle skip across a couple of grooves, and then it'll drop into the correct groove. Anyways, getting back to the music, We Magnify His Name, my ultimate top Robert Hood pick of all time. I love when Robert brings in the gospel house. In this scenario, I don't know where he got the sample from. It sounds like he had a whole church backing him up. Maybe it was just taken from a completely different record and fused into his own. Good for you, Robert. I love the energy of this track, the women and the men singing and almost like bouncing off of each other, feeding into each other's energy. This is an absolute masterpiece and really the crescendo of this episode. All right, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed these Robert Hood picks. As usual, feel free to comment down below. Recommend all of your Robert Hood remixes and original tracks that you adore. It's a big catalog. I'm sure I missed a few bangers out there, so let me know. Hope everyone's enjoying your late January, and be safe out there. Take care.